In the 1990s, Florence experienced its own footballing renaissance. Fiorentina became one of the most captivating teams in Italy, with iconic kits, iconic players, and a team capable of standing alongside the giants of Serie A at the height of its power. And for a moment, the Scudetto seemed within reach. But the story of Fiorentina's greatest era was never going to end with a championship. It ended in ruins. The story begins on the 16th of May 1990. Fiorentina had just been beaten by their most bitter rivals, Juventus, in the UEFA Cup final, losing 3-1 on aggregate. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But the real blow came just 2 days later. Owner Flavio Pontello sold their star man, Roberto Baggio, to Juventus for a world record £8 million. To make the betrayal complete, Baggio went on to shine at the 1990 World Cup and became a global superstar. As a result, the city exploded in anger. Fiorentina fans took to the streets, demanding that Pontello sell the club. The protest grew so intense that Pontello hid inside the stadium for his own safety. At that point, the relationship was finished. 1 month later, Pontello sold Fiorentina. In came film producer Mario Cecchi Gori and his son Vittorio. A new era had begun, one that would take the club on an unforgettable rollercoaster of brilliance, chaos, and heartbreak. In the upcoming 1990-91 season, Cecchi Gori's first big move was appointing Brazilian coach Sebastião Lazzaroni. With Baggio gone, Fiorentina were left without a player to build the team around, while Lazzaroni was tasked on building the new team. And the new season started in the worst possible way, a humiliating 4-0 home defeat to Roma on the opening day. Yet one match that year would leave a lasting mark when Roberto Baggio returned to the Stadio Franchi in a Juventus shirt. Emotions were still raw. Some supporters welcomed back the man they idolised, while others could barely bear to see the former hero wearing the colours of Juve. Fiorentina won the match 1-0. But what happened that afternoon will be remembered far longer than the result. In the second half, Juventus were awarded a penalty, and Baggio, who had already scored his first 5 penalties for his new club, but this time he refused to take it. He handed responsibility to a teammate, who missed from the spot. Shortly afterwards, Baggio was substituted. As he made his way around the pitch, a Fiorentina scarf landed at his feet. He bent down and picked it up and waved at the crowd. That quiet gesture said more than words ever could. Baggio had never wanted to leave Fiorentina. The following summer, a young star represented his country at the Copa America, with Fiorentina's vice president Vittorio Cecchi Gori watching from the stands as Gabriel Batistuta scored 6 goals in 6 games, finishing as the tournament's top goalscorer and helping Argentina win their first Copa America title since 1959. Batistuta was quickly signed from Boca and was bound for Europe. The new season started with Lazzaroni in charge, but after a difficult start, he was dismissed and Gigi Rigici took over in October. And Batistuta was beginning to make his mark in Serie A. Against Juve, he scored in a 2-0 victory. After losing Baggio, Fiorentina may have found their next idol. The Argentine would finish his first season with 13 league goals, and Fiorentina would finish 12th, the same position as the previous season. This was Serie A at the height of its power. The established giants of Juventus, Milan and Inter were now joined by a new generation of Italian tycoons, for whom owning a football club had become the ultimate power statement. Calcio Tanzi had his business empire behind Parma, while Sergio Cragnotti was doing the same at Lazio. And it was no different for Cecchi Gori in Florence. And he was about to show just how serious he was for the 92-93 season. Fiorentina went into the market and signed Danish winger Brian Laudrup and German midfielder Stefan Effenberg, both from Bayern Munich. Italian striker Francesco Baiano. With a successful transfer market, European qualification was the aim for the season. And the season started strongly. Fiorentina were impressive during the first half and were involved in some high-scoring games, including a 7-1 win over Ancona. But a series of damaging events, beginning with Cecchi Gori falling ill, would prove to be the catalyst for a rapid demise. And as the midway part of Serie A campaign approached, Cecchi Gori reluctantly passed the responsibilities at Fiorentina to his son. As the season entered the new year, Fiorentina was sitting second. But after a defeat to Atalanta, Vittorio made an immediate and impulsive decision that evening to sack Radici. His replacement was Aldo Agroppi, who had previously coached La Viola in the 85-86 season before being suspended for his involvement in a match-fixing scandal. It was his second spell at the Ateneo Franchi would prove disastrous. Groppi's team took just 10 points from 15 games, winning only twice, as Fiorentina nosedived down the table. With 5 matches remaining, with Luciani Chiaraghi, the Primavera manager, and club legend Giancarlo Antononi were brought in to try and salvage the situation, but the damage had already been done. Fiorentina finished 16th and were relegated from Serie A for the first time since 1939. It was, in many ways, self-sabotage. A sick Cecchi Gori Senior later admitted, "My son made a mistake, but they came from too much enthusiasm, too much love." Fiorentina dropped into Serie B, but Batistuta and Effenberg stayed, while the club also signed a young goalkeeper, Francesco Toldo, and with Claudio Ranieri now in charge, Fiorentina would come straight back up at the first attempt, with the team proving too strong for the division. But before promotion could be achieved, tragedy struck. Fiorentina were mourning the loss of Mario Cecchi Gori, who passed away after suffering a heart attack. The supporters were still angry with his son Vittorio, but their feelings towards his father were very different. Mario arrived in Florence in 1990, buying the club from Pontello and rescuing Fiorentina after the chaos surrounding Baggio's departure. The supporters paid tribute to the man who had given their club a new beginning. Now back in Serie A, Fiorentina would strengthen once again, bringing in Brazilian World Cup winner Marcelo Santos, alongside a young Rui Costa, midfielder from Benfica. Elegant on the ball, technically gifted, Fiorentina had found themselves another special player. And the Portuguese playmaker would contribute 9 Serie A league goals in his debut season. But it was Batistuta who remained the main man, scoring 26 goals and winning the Capocannoniere, despite Fiorentina sitting mid-table. But having steadied their ship in their first season, Fiorentina, led by Ranieri, would have an outstanding 95-96 season. And by halfway point in the campaign, La Viola was sitting second in Serie A. They would go on to put an impressive 15-game unbeaten run, but the title challenge would eventually fade, and Fiorentina would finish 4th. But there was still silverware to play for in the Coppa Italia. In the semi-final, Inter Milan was put to the sword with a hat-trick from Batistuta.
Effetto poi il numero di Batistuta, solo Batistuta, ed è un altro gol del capitano della Fiorentina.
And then scoring the only goal in the second leg.
Batistuta, pallonetto e ancora Batigol.
It would set up a final against Atalanta, and the first leg would be at home in Florence. And it was that man again. With the advantage going into the second leg, La Viola would comfortably win 2-0. Goals from Amoruso and Batigol to complete a 3-0 aggregate victory and their first Coppa Italia since 1975. However, as the team and fans celebrated back in Florence, there were already warning signs behind the scenes. While Fiorentina were beginning to emerge as a force on the pitch, Vittorio Cecchi Gori was building an empire of his own off it. He had bought 2 TV networks, Video Music and Tele Monte Carlo, with ambitions of creating a third television force in Italy and challenging the established power of Ra and Silvio Berlusconi's Vininvest. And for a moment, it looked as though he might pull it off. In early '96, his group was awarded the domestic TV rights to Serie A in a massive deal worth 640 billion lira over 3 years. But Cecchi Gori couldn't provide the financial guarantees required to complete the deal, and the league revoked it. It was an expensive gamble, one in which he lost, and he eventually would have to sell both companies for a massive loss. But on the field, the new season would start with silverware. In the curtain raiser to the new campaign, Fiorentina beat AC Milan to lift the Supercoppa Italiana.
Parte Batistuta ed è il gol! Batistuta raddoppia, firma la doppietta e forse firma la Coppa per la Fiorentina.
The previous 2 seasons had followed a similar pattern. Strong starts followed by fading title challenge. It felt like this year could be the turn, and a Scudetto within reach. Ranieri dipped into the market and purchased Andrei Kanchelskis. But the league form failed to live up to expectation, with Fiorentina finishing 9th. In Europe, however, there was still something to play for, as Fiorentina reached the semi-finals of the Cup Winners' Cup, where they faced Bobby Robson's Barcelona, and in the first leg at the Camp Nou, it ended in a draw. Giving hope of Fiorentina reaching a European final. However, a lacklustre performance at home. Losing 2-0 ruled out the chance of any more silverware, and it would be Ranieri's last season. In came Alberto Malassani, passionate and unconventional coach who changed the formation to his preferred 3-5-2, and Batistuta would lead the attack alongside Belgium Luis Oliveira or new Brazilian signing Edmundo. And Batigol would score 21 league goals as Fiorentina returned to their attacking ways and finished 5th in Serie A. But Malassani would only stay for 1 season, as he was tempted by Parma and left, and Fiorentina turned to one of the biggest names in Italian football, Giovanni Trapattoni. The 98-99 season, and with Trapattoni installed as manager, a man who had won everything under Juventus in the mid-70s and 80s, before claiming another title with Inter in 89. He would return to Juventus in the 90s and have 2 spells outside Italy at Bayern. Now, he was in Florence. And 3 new signings arrived with him: Torricelli from Juventus, Heinrich from Borussia Dortmund, and Czech centre-back Thomas Repka from Sparta Prague. And Trapattoni immediately began reshaping the side. He would try to fit all 3 forwards, Batistuta, Edmundo and Oliveira, into a 3-4-3, but also regularly reverted to a 4-3-3. And at other times he kept the wing-backs and loaded the midfield, dropping Rui Costa behind the 2-man attack. The system was flexible. The season started brightly. On the 3rd match day at the San Siro, Batistuta produced a stunning hat-trick as Fiorentina beat AC Milan 3-1. It was a real statement performance. And with Batistuta, Edmundo and Rui Costa all in sparkling form, La Viola surged up the table. And by the halfway stage they sat top as winter champions. And for the first time in almost 3 decades, genuine belief returned that the Scudetto might finally be within reach. Their European adventure, however, ended before Christmas. In the second round of the UEFA Cup against Grasshoppers, the return leg, played in Salerno because of a stadium ban, was abandoned at half-time. A firecracker had exploded near the fourth official, and UEFA disqualified Fiorentina and awarded the tie to the Swiss side. Back in Serie A, the momentum continued until early February in a tense 0-0 home draw with Milan. Batistuta twisted his knee, and he would miss several matches. Without their talisman, results immediately suffered, and when he finally returned, he was still not fully fit, and Fiorentina suffered a humiliating 4-1 defeat away to Venezia, where a young Alvaro Recoba scored a hat-trick. But there was another problem. Edmundo. On the very night Batistuta was injured, the Brazilian known as the Animal was already on a plane back home to Brazil. A clause in his contract allowed him to attend the Rio Carnival, and he made full use of it, reportedly saying he was going and did not know when he would come back. And for Trapattoni, the timing could hardly been worse. The team were chasing their first Scudetto since 1969. Edmundo eventually returned, but the damage had been done. After the Venezia defeat, Fiorentina only won 2 of their remaining games, and the Scudetto slipped away. And Milan claimed the title, and Fiorentina ended third with 56 points, enough to secure them Champions League qualification the following season, however. And the Coppa Italia brought further frustration. Fiorentina reached the final against Parma, managed by their former coach, Alberto Malesani, and after 2 hard-fought draws, 1-1 in Parma and 2-2 in Florence, they lost the cup on away goals. For Batistuta, it was becoming too much, and years later he would look back on the Carnival episode as the moment everything changed. I hurt my knee and my partner is flying to the Carnival, and despite the importance of the moment, the bosses allowed him to leave. I considered it a betrayal. He said the story effectively put an end to his career at Fiorentina, but Trapattoni managed to convince him to stay with the lure of Champions League football, and Fiorentina strengthened significantly that summer, bringing in a host of new players, Chiesa, Mijatovic and Delivio among some. Yet they could not repeat the near miss of the previous campaign, and an inconsistent Serie A season saw them finish 7th. In Europe, however, there were still memorable nights. At Wembley, Fiorentina faced Arsenal, and Batistuta produced one of the defining moments of the campaign.
Batistuta, si allunga il pallone, Batistuta, rete! La rete di Batistuta!
Then a 3-3 thriller against Barcelona, which produced one of the best goals ever in Champions League football. Then came the second group phase. Back in Florence, the reigning European champions Manchester United arrived at the Franchi, and once again the Viola rose to the occasion. And though they failed to escape the second group, those European nights gave the supporters something special to hold on to. But behind the scenes, Cecchi Gori's personal life was becoming increasingly complicated, including a messy divorce from his famous Italian singer and actress, Rita Rusick. The financial fallout only added further pressure to an already fragile situation. With the frustration of another near miss still fresh, Batistuta felt his chance of winning a Scudetto with Fiorentina was slipping away. The striker, one of the most feared forwards in Europe after 9 seasons and 204 goals, secured a transfer to Fabio Capello's Roma. That same season, he would finally win the title he had chased for so long. There was deep disappointment and anger among the Fiorentina fans, though most of their fury was directed at Cecchi Gori rather than at Batistuta himself. And when he scored against his old club, Batistuta burst into tears. He was not the only major departure. Trapattoni left to become the new manager of the Italian national team, and in his place, the club appointed Turkish coach Fatih Terim, fresh from winning the UEFA Cup with Galatasaray. And Batistuta's departure was offset by the arrival of Portuguese striker Nuno Gomes. Terim was popular with the players and the fans. Fiorentina thrived under him, beating Inter 2-0 and thrashing Milan 4-0 thanks to an inspired Rui Costa, and by the end of January they were sitting second in the table. But tensions with Cecchi Gori quickly emerged and Terim resigned in February, and he would immediately take up the reins at AC Milan. Fiorentina then made a bold decision, handing the job to Roberto Mancini. The player was winding down his career with a brief spell at Leicester City, but he had long been regarded as a manager on the pitch during his successful years at Sampdoria and Lazio. And Mancini steered the side to 9th place in Serie A, with Chiesa scoring 22 goals. And more significantly, he delivered silverware. And with a measure of revenge in the Coppa Italia, Fiorentina defeated Parma 2-1 on aggregate to lift the trophy. But the joy would not last. In the aftermath of the Coppa Italia triumph, debts of £94 million were revealed, with £41 million that Cecchi Gori himself was required to pay by the 12th of July. The 2001 transfer window turned into a fire sale of the club's best remaining players. Rui Costa, Prince of Florence, reluctantly left for Milan, and Francesco Toldo joined Inter. Cecchi Gori had leveraged debt against the Florence club. Now the situation had reached breaking point. He became subject of an investigation by the authorities over possible money laundering. And for the 2001-2002 season, Fiorentina's only realistic aim was survival among the chaos. After just 5 games, Chiesa suffered a serious ACL injury, and then Mancini would leave in January. Although the club managed to bring in a young Adriano on loan in the winter window, their fate was sealed. La Viola finished 17th and were relegated, and with Serie B waiting, the club was denied a place by the Italian Federation. Players had gone unpaid for 5 months, and funds had been embezzled. It would later be proven that Cecchi Gori had withdrawn money from the then healthy club to support his struggling holding company. Fiorentina was forced into liquidation after the owner failed to produce the funds needed to save the club. Thankfully, new ownership arrived, and a Phoenix club was formed, forced to begin again in the 4th tier of Italian football. The Cecchi Gori family had overseen the golden age of Fiorentina. Florence, the birthplace of the Renaissance, gave the club an artistic, underdog spirit that set it apart from the big industrial clubs of Milan and Turin. Over the years, the club experienced almost everything. Deep bonds with its greatest stars, from Baggio to Batistuta and Rui Costa. Moments of pure magic and the agonising near miss of lifting the Scudetto. They did not win as much as they deserved, but it was iconic. It was unforgettable. It was a golden era.